Hey, you awesome folks! Thanks for taking this journey of discovery with your guide, Keith Haney. You're listening to the Becoming Bridge Builders podcast, your favorite podcast for everything from racial reconciliation to education innovation, justice reform, and leading change in the 21st century. This podcast is for people who love to be challenged with difficult topics, but want practical solutions to solve these challenging issues. Becoming Bridge Builders makes change possible. Each week on the podcast, Keith invites innovative thought leaders to share how they are building bridges in their area of expertise. You will hear breakthrough ideas and concepts that are changing the world. He's featuring guests who are best-selling authors, leaders at Microsoft, entrepreneurs, leading educators, professors, lawyers, and so many more. Listen in to learn how you can be the bridge to the change you are seeking.
My guest today is Steve Brigham. He's a leader in the public engagement field who for the past 24 years has served with great success as facilitator, consultant, and designer of complex public meetings and community building processes on critical public policy issues. From 2001 to 2013, he was COO, then president of American Speaks. He co-founded Public Engagement Associations in 2014 to provide outstanding community and stakeholder engagement in the Metro DC area. He has led more than 75 large-scale public and stakeholder engagement projects in cities across the country and internationally. In the past 10 years, his consulting is focused on local issues like land use, policy, affordable housing, transportation, economic development, and public school redistricting, to name a few. Steve's work has increasingly tackled racial equality, equitable development issues in his work and volunteer time. Steve is incredibly grateful for the two biracial children aged 21 and 16 who has blessed his life daily. We welcome Steve to the podcast. Well, Steve, welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm great, Keith. How are you?
I'm phenomenal. It's good to have you on. I'm looking forward to this conversation. This should be fun.
It should be fun. It definitely should be fun.
So I'm going to ask you my favorite question of all my guests. You cannot escape this question no matter
Okay.
no matter who you are or how famous you are. But the question is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Okay. So probably from my mom, who's still living. She's 92 and a half. And, she always told me to follow my heart.
Oh, I love that.
And so, especially, as you become an adult and you kind of get caught in the rat race, it's like, no, follow your heart. Do what's important to you. Do what has meaning for you. Follow your heart. So
I love that. That's good advice. Good sound advice from mom.
yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, Steve, as you think about your life, there are always people in our lives who served as an inspiration, maybe even a mentor. Who were some people in your life that you want to kind of give a shout out to that were really meaningful in your journey?
So I would say first is Carolyn Lukensmeyer, who started an organization in 1996 called America Speaks, brought me on board in 2001 to be the COO. It was a national nonprofit focused on giving citizens greater voice in policy and decision making, whether at the local or national level. And she was just really kind of a brilliant thinker, brilliant facilitator. And I learned so much from her. And I still look up to her today. When I did my book launch party about 2-3 months ago, she was in the audience, even at 80 years old. So she's been kind of an inspiration to me for 25 years, both in making sure citizens and community members have voice, but also just what it means to facilitate an excellent conversation and to think critically about policy issues.
Oh, that's so much fun. I got a chance during my doctoral work to go visit DC. That was one of our task was to go to DC and see how the sausage is made.
Right. It's kind of ugly.
It is ugly. But it was fascinating because you got a new appreciation for, I think, how difficult making good policy is. And
Absolutely.
to evaluate whether your policy is helping or harming and is really accomplishing its intent. So it was a fascinating lesson for me about, you just can't make a policy and then just leave it without coming back and assessing whether or not the policy is actually doing what you hope it's going to do.
Right, because there's a huge difference and sometimes gap between intent and outcomes, right? So,
Exactly. So,
yeah.
so let's get into your book. What inspired you to write It's Never Been a Level Playing Field?
So there's kind of the long story and short story, and maybe I'll tell the middle story. Um, I I grew up in an all white town in Connecticut, in a town probably not different than a lot of towns in Iowa, really. And when I was in high school, so my dad had started a nonprofit in the aftermath of King's assassination, Kennedy's assassination. He started in our all white town, bringing young or teenage Black and Hispanic boys to our town, which had one of the top public school systems in the state, to live there for 3 years, sophomore, junior, senior year, so they could graduate and have a greater opportunity for going to a good college, etc. And that program is still going on 55 years later.
Wow.
And so for the very first time when I was in high school, I had 3 Black friends. Up until then, none. Right. Got to know them. Got to know them as people. Which as a white person growing up in an all white world, it's like, are they really different from us? Are we better than them? Right. So it really kind of humanized for me and allowed me to develop real personal relationships. And then when I went away to college and then off into the workplace for the next 10 years, so this is like late 70s to late 80s, my world once again was predominantly white, sometimes almost exclusively white, where I went to college, where I went to work. And so when I came to DC in 1988, and I've been here for now, this is my 37th year, I made a conscious intent to really get to know African Americans again. Because when I moved here, it was a majority Black city known as Chocolate City, right? And there were a lot of, for the first time in my life, kind of meeting middle class, upper middle class African Americans who were also in my workplace, who I went to grad school, they were in my grad school. So it was much easier to kind of integrate if you chose to, and I chose to. So I made friends, had great colleagues, met my then fiance wife, now ex-wife, who's African American. And so my whole journey in DC over 37 years has really been about kind of getting to know African Americans, getting to know the issues around race and kind of why there's such racial differences with regard to outcomes and even opportunities. And so it was really kind of a self-learning for me over my many years here. When the pandemic hit in 2020, I had in my mind I wanted to really write something around what do we white people need to know about our history for why we are where we are with regard to race. And so, and I literally started the day that they shut the state down. It was like March 12th, 2020. And I wrote continuously for a year, had a long kind of unwieldy draft, and then over the space of the next 2.5, 3 years, I revised it significantly and finally published it last July. And it really is, it's called It's Never Been a Level Playing Field, Overcoming 8 Racial Myths to Even the Field. And so it really looks into great depth the history of kind of what has become myths and kind of what, and to dispel each of them. And then the last part of the book really is looking at, so I'm a supporter of reparations, but I don't believe they're going to happen in my lifetime. What do we do in place of reparations that will repair harm, provide redress to some degree, and really transform American society so it is a much more even field for African Americans? So that's, and if that's my middle story, I can't even tell you what my long story would be.
No, that's really good and helpful. I am curious. You talk about you have 8 myths in your book.
Yeah.
Which of those you think is the most pervasive myth that you discuss?
So I have 8 myths, and I think the first and last one are really kind of capstone myths that undergird the whole kind of mythical enterprise. So the first myth is America provides an equal playing field for all, which, I throughout the entire book, I look at housing, health, education, economy, and show how that's just not true. The second myth that I would point to is the concluding myth is that systemic racism doesn't exist anymore. I think a lot of people prefer to believe, oh yeah, there's still bigots out there, but there's no systemic racism. And for me, the whole book is kind of laying out all the different systems that continue to be racist, discriminatory, exclusionary, that lead to the kind of the differences and gaps and inequities that we see. And so for example, the overarching myth, America provides an equal playing field for all. The thing that I lay out primarily in that myth is, if you look across every single sector, public sector, private sector, different levels of government, different private sector industries, if you look at who's leading those, it's often 9%, 95%, 98% white. And often there, it's white men, not even white women, right? And so it's like, if we really had an even playing field, how do we explain the fact that whites, and especially white males, continue to dominate, and sometimes like almost exclusively, in almost every single sector? So that's kind of a major way I try to dispel that myth. And the last one really is around, there still is bigotry and bigots throughout our nation. African Americans confront them almost every day, whether subtly or not so subtly. But our systems of education, we still see major gaps in outcomes, because the vast majority of African American students, K through 12, go to high poverty, low opportunity schools. Why is that? Kind of the other thing that I really try to explore is, we're still dealing with major residential segregation by race in this country, despite the fact the civil rights laws, the Fair Housing Act, all these other things, we're still hyper-segregated in most places. And that segregation means that in wealthier communities, mainly white, higher opportunity, higher wealth, better education, and vice versa for African Americans. So it's like, how can we not have systemic racism, because we're still so segregated in so many arenas of our lives?
It's funny, when I wrote my first book that I wrote was actually a Bible study on how we heal race in America. And I was kind of talking to a church audience, and it's really hard to talk about race in the church, because the church doesn't want to deal with some common realities that are part of the church and the issues that we struggle with, because even though we're not secular organization, we still have some of the secular influences in the church. And
Absolutely.
I found that it was easier to abandon the term systemic racism and replace it with systemic oppression, because then I could talk about it and look at it without having to unpack what systemic racism is. And I say, what's oppression? It is when one group imposes will on another group. And then all of a sudden we could have a discussion, because then you can look at it and not be triggered, at least initially. Right. But look at the issues that are there. Like, you talk education. I mean, I grew up serving congregations in Detroit, in St. Louis, inner city Milwaukee, Chicago, and the education was not the same. The levels were not the same, and you pointed out. And it's a struggle to really help. It was so frustrating to have a kid one day ask him, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And she said, it really doesn't matter, because I'm not going to live past 25.
Right. That's a common thing you hear in DC.
Right. And so it's to not understand that is a part of the mindset. You don't understand why aren't you reading more books? So I read books for what? What's it going to get me if I don't see opportunity somehow along the way? So I appreciate you bringing out some of those points.
Yeah, absolutely. And it shows up in every aspect, every sector of our lives, and including in faith-based institutions, right?
Right.
I mean, the history of the Christian church and the Catholic Church was highly racist and discriminatory and exclusionary for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So
Yeah, I mean,
You don't just all of a sudden get rid of it.
you don't. No, and actually, looking at, I read a book for a review I just did on the history of Black Lutheranism, Blacks in Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and there was still, even with that, a history of, you can come to church, but you have to sit up in the balcony. You can't sit below because that's where the
Wow.
white people are sitting. And this is happening in church. And
Yeah.
so we don't like to look at the history because we want to believe that we're better than society around us. But we still struggle with the same issues. The mindsets, the myths are still there that divide what we can be and who God has created us to be. So I'm curious, as you look at these myths and how they intersect and kind of reinforce each other, um, how does the basis for the system, look at the system and all these myths and how they kind of have ingrained themselves into our systems?
So, one of the things I say is, systemic racism hasn't disappeared. It's still a Gordian knot, right? It's like how do you untangle all these different systems that have different histories, different policies, different practices, and they intersect and interact with one another, right? And so, uh, it's not an easy thing to address. One of the things that I'm focused on right now, I write a weekly newsletter looking at both the history, the legacy, as well as solutions. And one of the ways that we in America can fundamentally change over the next 10, 15, 20 years, to desegregate neighborhoods is change how we think about land use and zoning at the local level, municipal, county, what have you, right? And people, oh, that's so kind of, that doesn't, like, what does that do? But our systems of zoning in America that date back 100 years were to keep whites and blacks separate, right? And it was to build single family detached homes primarily in whiter, wealthier neighborhoods, and not allowing multifamily housing or smaller houses or duplexes or triplexes. And so, um, that's one of the ways zoning remains exclusionary. So how do we, at the local level, like in my county, it's now over the last 6, 7 years, I live in Prince George's County, Maryland. How do you create a more inclusionary zoning ordinance so that these neighborhoods can become more economically integrated, racially integrated, and that folks who traditionally are kept far away from amenities like good grocery stores, right, or access to transit, now have an opportunity to live in more racially mixed neighborhoods, more economically mixed neighborhoods with greater access to amenities. And as you probably know, there's a major housing crisis, especially affordable housing crisis, all across America. I'm sure it's happening in Iowa too, where we just have not built enough homes over the last 20, 30 years. And that's why people are paying far too much for the housing they have. So we need to build more, but it's also a matter of where we build and what kinds of housing we build. And if communities are willing to do that, like the thousands of communities across the country, we will be looking 20 years from now at more racially integrated, economically integrated neighborhoods. It won't be easy because there'll still be a lot of pushback. It's like, oh, I didn't buy my $700,000 home to have people who don't look like me, have a apartment building right next door, right? Or even in my town or in my ward. So it's not like, oh, well, we'll just change all the zoning everywhere and things will be far better. There's going to be a lot of pushback. There's going to be a lot of resistance. But as I've been looking at this, there's a hell of a lot of communities that are coming to this realization and beginning to make changes in how they zone, what can be put where, and really trying to make these neighborhoods more racially equitable.
So we've talked about two things that are really important: housing, education. We haven't talked about justice system. But if you look at those three, because I think those three are critical and they're all interconnected,
Absolutely.
which of those three would you say, if we could fix this one first, would have the greatest impact?
So it's saying get housing, education, and
Just justice.
justice. It's so hard, and I guess my easy way out is there are so many different groups, organizations, people working on changing different systems that it's not just, oh, well, for the next 10 years, let's just focus on education and justice is going to have to wait. I think we have to work in parallel. You know, it was disheartening to me after the all the George Floyd murder protests that there was this real energy to change justice systems, change policing systems. And when you look 4 years later, not a whole hell of a lot happened. Because again, there was one of the things that we see in America, and this is myth 7, and I'll actually read it to you. Embracing Blacks' access to rights, progress, and power myth. The days of restricting the rights and progress of Black people are long gone. And I think the justice thing was a perfect example of that. It's like there's this. We need to dramatically reform how we do policing in America, especially in cities, right? We need to change the justice system in terms of what you can get prosecuted for and sentencing and how long you can keep people. And then when they come out, what resources do they have access to? And the whole mass incarceration fiasco over the last 40 years. So I think it's I guess my answer is we need to be changing these all simultaneously with pretty significant sense of urgency, because all of them are embedded with kind of almost automatic resistance to change. And so we've just got to keep on it. And there's lots of school reformers out there. There's lots of justice reformers out there, public health, etc. And even all of those pushing over the last 20 years for some of the things that I talk about in the book. The progress is always incremental and not guaranteed to stay in place, right?
Exactly, because you fix one, it's like putting your fingers in a dam. You put your finger in one hole, another one pops up. So
Right, exactly. It's whack-a-mole.
it is.
Whack-a-mole.
I had a guest on my podcast years ago who was in the justice system, and he says, some things that people don't really realize is that when you get stopped for a particular crime, if you don't have the money to get out of jail, and it may be a small amount, but if you don't have access to that or know how to get that, you go to jail, you lose your job, and all of a sudden your entire life is destroyed for something that could be very minor that most people will never go to jail for. And so he talked about he wasn't necessarily promoting cashless bail, but he was saying we need to figure out a different processing system when people are engaged in activities that put them in front of the justice system without the proper resources to deal with what they're facing.
Yeah, it's some scholars call this it's the criminalization of poverty, right? Yeah. It's like, and again, it happens to Black people, white people, Hispanic people, Asian people who are of lesser means, but it happens disproportionately to Black people. And I just finished in December writing a 3-part series looking at Ferguson. And how did Ferguson get to be what Ferguson actually is, and kind of what's also happened since. And when the Justice Department took a look at what was going on in Ferguson, what they found was, and this was true in municipalities throughout St. Louis County, right? The whole policing and court system is based, like 35% of the town's budget is based on ticketing people, right? That's how and then it's fees on top of that, right? And it's like, so like you said, you get, you're working a minimum wage job and you get a ticket or something, or you do something wrong and you end up a night in jail or 2 days in jail or what have you. And then you don't show up for work. So you lose your work. So now you have no means to pay. And then, once the ticket or fee is due, you don't pay it, then it gets doubled or tripled and so then there's no chance that you're ever going to pay it off. And so people are sitting with, court summons and everything else. And this was happening. 90+% of the people who were caught up in this in Ferguson were Black, even though they're 67% or 70% of the population. So it's not that white people in Ferguson also weren't weren't dealing with it, but they were dealing with it, in much lower proportions. And so, how do we change that? So it's gotten better in Ferguson. It still hasn't gone away. It's still a important part of the budget, but it's much less. There's now a black police chief there. There's now a majority black school board. Before there was only one black board member. There's now a majority black city council, whereas before there was only one member. There's now a black mayor so things are changing in Ferguson for the better on all those fronts, but there's still the criminalization of poverty happening there. That has not gone away in Ferguson and the communities around it. So yeah, it's amazing to me what we don't know, especially for me as a white person, until you really begin digging in. It's like, I'd never heard of Ferguson before Michael Brown was murdered, right? And all of a sudden, everybody knows about Ferguson. But it's like, how did Ferguson get to be the way it was? Well, Ferguson was an all-white town until 1970. It was a sundown town. So if you were black up until 1970, you had to be out of town by sundown, right? And like many places, once blacks were able to move in, whites began moving out, but whites kept hold of the political power. White police chief, white mayor, white council, etc. So, things change and things don't change.
It's funny you mentioned Ferguson. My congregation served in a neighboring town, Walnut Park, Missouri.
Yep.
And the story of our church actually was that it was pretty much a stable white community, and all of a sudden they changed the housing rules in Walnut Park. And so all the blacks started moving in and the whites tried to move out, but the members of the church still owned their houses. Were
the property and
the houses were the basis for the loan. And so they stayed until the church was paid off, then gave the keys to the black members who were there, and then they all moved. But it was interesting. So they kept control of the church and how the church operated, to make sure that the bills got paid until they all left. But it was interesting because I knew that Ferguson community because I lived next to it, and I knew when the Michael Brown thing happened, that was not the community that I knew, and there was a lot of pain there that people. And I always tell people, when you look at the things that happen sometimes with people rising up in anger over what's happening in their community, you need to know the backstory. You need to know there's a much deeper reason and probably hurt there that no one's paying attention to. And sometimes the only way to get attention is to let you know exactly how angry they are about either the housing or the justice system or all of those things that are impacting their daily lives. Like no one chooses to live in a crime-ridden, poverty-infested community. They don't.
Right.
When people say just get up and move, well, it's not that easy. You just can't get up and move.
That used to be so I had a good friend that I lived with in DC for 6-7 years before he moved out west. And, he always used to say, we would talk about the poverty, and he said, well, why don't they just move? It's like, well, it's not that simple. You and I can move. A, we're single. B, we make a decent salary, right? And we can be mobile. But a lot, you may not have a car. You may not have any savings, right? You may be behind on your bills because, there's like 101 reasons why you're not able to move, or you got 3 kids and it's too, you can't hire a mover, or whatever the case may be. And I think a lot of white people, a lot of people of means, it's just like, well, nothing's keeping them there. They can move. They choose to stay there. And it's like, yeah, it's not that simple.
And I think sometimes we fall into I can find a successful story that came out of that situation so everybody can do it. That's also kind of minimizing the hurt and the challenge that it is to do that. It's not, everybody can't do that. Everybody doesn't have those opportunities. So picking the 1 or 2 stories of success doesn't mean that everybody has that opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, that's one of the things. It's the whole, what is it? Horatio Alger story about pulling yourself up. Anybody can do it, right? And it's the individual myth in America versus, what it takes. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to have a successful community, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about, every single person pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. It doesn't work that way.
I'm curious, as you did research for this book, what was the one thing that you found that was most shocking for you?
Man, I had shocks every week. I told someone the other day, I thought I knew a lot going into writing the book and researching the book, but when you really delve into it, and I wrote 12 different chapters covering very different complex topics, I feel like I didn't know 70% of what I wrote about until I researched it and figured out how to put it to paper. But I guess what I would say is, so let me just read a couple statistics that were just like, are you freaking kidding me? Right? So Black adults are paid significantly less than white adults at every educational level. From those who lack a high school diploma, white and Black without a high school diploma, usually make 20% more, all the way up to college and advanced degrees. So it's like, okay, how is this a level playing field if same level of educational accomplishment, but when they get in the workplace, it's so different, right? So that was one. Another is that nearly 50% of Black students attend a high poverty school, almost always a low performing school, compared to 6% of white students. So is it really fair between our white students and our Black students in America? The Black unemployment rate has been double the rate of whites for 60 years. And most of that time, right, it was at above 10%, where if whites are at 10%, then you're looking at a deep economic recession. But because it was Blacks, it was like, well, whites, the unemployment rate's 5%, so we don't have a whole lot to worry about, right? So, and then the final one, and this gets to the justice system. Blacks make up 15% of the country's drug users. They're 13% of the population. But they're 37% of those arrested for drug violations. They're 59% of those who are convicted for those violations. And they are 74% of those sent to prison for a drug offense. Level playing field? It's a different justice system for Black people.
Yeah.
It really is. And that to me it's like, wow, holy crap. How is that true? But in 2024, it's true.
So your book has a call to action. And I'm curious, what are some of the solutions or some of the call to actions you identified from your work and your research?
So I broke it up into 4 chapters. So even though I had 8 chapters around myths, they're so tied together, right? So
Right.
one was, how do we transform the educational landscape for our African American youth? So for an example, fund universal birth to 3, pre-K 3, and pre-K 4 programs. It's gonna benefit everybody, but it's gonna disproportionately benefit Black children. Right now, I think it's something like 4 to 5% of young Black kids go to a high quality K3, K4 program. Wow, right? So how do we fund this, either at the federal level, state level, local level, some combination, so that every kid, from the time their parent has to go back to work after 3 or 4 months, right? How do we make sure that they are in high quality, universally funded programs from the time they're 3 months old to the time they're ready to go into kindergarten? Especially for Black students, that would make a fundamental difference about readiness for school and kind of the whole pathway beyond. Then I talk about providing a Black New Deal for African American high school graduates. It's like, if you know something is waiting for you in terms of kind of guaranteed paying of some kind of post-secondary education, whether that's a trade school, whether that's a traditional, college or university, that will be taken care of for you. Your listeners may not know the New Deal in the 1930s, which is always considered like a transformative moment in America, for the most part, excluded African Americans intentionally in terms of economics, in terms of housing, in terms of just about, opportunity, in terms of loans for housing, you name it. Same thing with the GI Bill. So it's like, when are we finally going to say we have done to the African American community so many wrongs that there are specific ways we can do right? And to me, some kind of Black New Deal for African American high school graduates makes a lot of sense. Tripling Pell Grants, increasing federal Title I funding of schools, where the majority of Black students attend Title I schools, right? So, you can't be on an equal playing field if you have so many things strikes against you, and then you're not getting the sufficient funding required to make a high quality school and provide high quality education. So that's just in the education arena. But we talked about transforming housing and zoning law, enacting comprehensive environmental justice. People may not know the Supreme Court passed a law 100 years ago, 102 years ago now, that basically allowed environmentally polluting facilities to be placed either in or adjacent to Black communities. And that continued to happen for decades, right? And then the same thing happened. It was like we need to put highways through our cities. Well, let's put it through an inner city neighborhood, completely disrupt the neighborhood. But for those who are left behind, they're inhaling all of this car and truck exhaust, right? So it's like there are so many things that need to be done on an environmental justice front. Deploy a public banking system, either through, like the state of North Dakota has a public bank that everyone has access to. We could make a postal office banking system, right? Where there's a postal office in just about every community in America. Right now, I think it's close to 40% of the underbanked and the unbanked in America are African American. So they end up having to deal with predatory lenders and predatory, financiers just for getting, like paying my rent this month or my utilities this month. And but we're going to charge you, 50% interest until you pay it back, right? So that keeps Black people from staying above water and even being able to build wealth. So what if we have a very different banking system that serves everybody, as opposed to the banking system that we have now, which in the last 20 years has seen a lot of bank branches get pulled out of African American communities and a lot of other high poverty communities. So I try and address kind of each of the areas that I talk about in my book and say, what would make a transformative difference? It's not reparations. Nothing can be reparations. But what do we need to do to address specific places where we know systemic racism exists and try to undo it in a very significant way?
So from my time in DC, I discovered that nothing gets done without a lobbyist behind it.
Right.
So who's gonna be the lobbyist for what these ideas? I mean, these are good ideas, but how do you get politicians to actually pay attention to the issues that need to be addressed?
Well, let me put it this way. If the election had gone differently in November, there would have been a lot more openness to a number of the things that I talk about in the book. I feel like in some ways, at least at the federal national level, we're going to be holding our breath for a lot of these things for at least another 4 years, unfortunately. I think there are things that can be done at the more local level. And I think a lot of people, including myself at times, feel very detached from what happens at the national level. It's like you engage in an election year, you vote, and then it's like they're going to do whatever they're going to do. But at the local level, like I said, we can change housing and zoning laws. We can change the way school boundaries are drawn. We can change the way schools are funded. Like in the state of Maryland, there's a whole, I forget the exact name, but it's like a transformative blueprint for success for all schools and all students in the state of Maryland. And it's like a 10, 15-year plan with significantly more money invested in student success, more rigorous curriculum, higher quality teachers, after school programs, and on and on and on. All the things that we know we should be funding so that all can be successful. So, that's happening at both the state and the county level in Maryland. That can happen in other places. I was listening to a podcast a couple of years ago and talking about changing the policing system, right? Well, it's like you can't change the policing system at the federal level. You can do consent decrees like they did on the Ferguson Police Department, but those last a long time and they don't always do what you need them to do. But every policing system gets the vast majority of its funding from the local municipality or county, right? So it's like, if you want to change the policing system, work on that in your town or your county, so that we make sure that they abolish chokeholds. We make sure that police are properly trained. We make sure that police are well trained in de-escalation techniques. That they're not continuing to get military apparatus in order to it's like every police department now wants to have a major SWAT team and the latest weaponry that comes out of the Pentagon or whatever the case may be. It's like we really need to look at especially what are the police practices that jeopardize African Americans, and what can be done at the local policing level, whether that's changing the practices and procedures, or it's putting in office new county council members or a new county executive or a new mayor that is supportive of that. Those things can be done. Again, the challenge here, it's like you'll see progress in different places, right, and not in others. But for some of these things, it's like, if we're serious, let me at least make my home place far better, far more just, far more equitable.
I love that. I gotta ask you this question. It's my second favorite question to ask my guests.
Okay. All right. Comes at the end. All right. You've been holding on.
What do you want your legacy to be?
That's a tough one, especially, it's a question I've been asking myself for several years, because I'm 63. Hopefully I won't be working at least for pay for too many more years, but I've got a 16-year-old sophomore in high school. So, I'll be at it for at least another 6 or 7 years. So I guess I would say my legacy, I'd like my legacy to be more, I'm able to introduce more and more white people to the history of racism in America and why that still impacts us today in significant ways, and take seriously some of the ideas that I propose for what we can do to change. So that's one. And I would say, I'm hoping that my legacy in state of Maryland, and in particular Prince George's County, which by the way is a majority African American county, that I can continue to do my work and my volunteer work in ways that change the systems locally, so that this county is more just and more equitable.
Actually,
and then I want to be a good dad for my kids the rest of my life.
There you go. I was actually in your county not long ago, about a year ago. So
okay, what were you doing there?
I was there for a conference, and so I was at Pastor Jenkins' church in.
So. Yeah, that's where my kids grew up.
Yeah, no, it was a great experience to kind of see walk again behind the curtain of what happens in the church.
Absolutely, so. Yeah. No, First Baptist of Glenarden. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he's great. They do a lot of really good work in the community.
They do.
And have a really big impact, a really big following. So yeah, he and other pastors in Prince George's County, I think, are an important force to make sure we residents really kind of leverage in what the churches in Prince George's can do.
Exactly.
They're a major influence here for sure.
They definitely are. As we wrap up this great conversation, I really have enjoyed our time together.
Me too.
What key takeaways do you want to leave with the audience who hear our conversation today?
So I guess the one key takeaway is either get active or remain active on the issues you care about, whether locally or beyond. We continue to have mountains to climb, especially with the most recent election, where I don't think this administration or this Congress will be very favorable towards a lot of these ideas, but not give up the fight, and to take the fight in places where you can make change. And then, I'd love it if more people would read my book. So you can find my book, It's Never Been a Level Playing Field, on Amazon.com, whether you like Kindle, paperback, or hardback. And then I'd love more people to read my regular newsletter. So I write on a writer's platform called Substack, Substack, and the title of my newsletter is "Leveling the Field Finally." Leveling the field finally. I'm cranking stuff out on a regular basis to hopefully continue to educate and inspire people, and I'd love to be able to increase my readership.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for what you do, and thanks for writing the book and tackling some tough issues. If we don't have the tough conversations, nothing ever changes. So I appreciate you having the courage to make and to take on these tough topics.
Well, I appreciate the time that you've given me here, and I love the name of your podcast, Building Bridges, because without a doubt, if we don't do that, we're not going to get very far.
And it was based on what actually happened in Ferguson.
Is that right?
It was, because that's when I wrote my Bible study, because of what happened with the situation in Ferguson. It didn't really take off until what happened with George Floyd, though.
Right.
Because there was no need to have a conversation until we were all sitting at home.
Yeah,
because Ferguson was so far away, unless you lived in the St. Louis area.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. But yeah, people had nothing else to do, so it's all right. Well, let's talk about this then.
Right, exactly.
What's got to happen?
Well, I'd love to have you back on again. I think we have a great conversation that we started, and we can continue to have some good resources to give to people to think about and to make a difference in their local communities.
I'd love that, Keith. So just give me a buzz whenever you want.
Well, blessings, Steve.
All right. To you too. Thanks, Keith. Take care.
Do you know that most entrepreneurs hit a revenue ceiling and have no idea why? They're working harder, spending more money, running more ads, but revenue stays flat. My friend Dr. Noah St. John calls this the invisible break. He's giving our listeners a free revenue ceiling audit to help you see what's really holding you back. You'll get a free 30-day membership to Noah Bot, giving you access to Dr. Noah's 30 years of experience to help you reach your next level. But hurry, because there's only 50 available this month. So if you're tired of being stuck at the same revenue level and want to finally break through, get your free revenue ceiling audit at drnoahvault.com in the affiliate link that'll be listed in the show notes.
Thanks for listening to Becoming Bridge Builder. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at @bkeithhaney and on Getter and Twitter @RevHeadpin. Thanks again, and tune in next time.